So we're ready for question and answer. I think we had a question back there. Gord Elliott. Paul has the mic. He'll give it to you, and then...
I wanted to ask Bill Tufts. You mentioned about the pensions at the Toronto Transit Commission. My father worked there for 30 years, and he collected a pension for 36 years. Is that a sustainable model?
Depending on who the unions elect. And that's all it's based on, is just the political ability for the unions. I think Canadians are probably blissfully unaware of the impact that unions have on our Canadian political system. And no, it's not sustainable, but who knows what the end point is? Who knows when we hit the wall?
Ian wants to comment on that too, and maybe John will as well. I don't know, but...
I published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal in the States with Professor Vijay Jog about 2 years ago, reviewing the entire pension system in Canada. And one of the solutions we came up with, which I'm sure is not going to be popular with everybody, is that we increase the minimum, what we called pensionable age for all pensions, public, private sector, regardless, to 65. In other words, you can quit your job anytime you want, but you cannot draw a pension before 65. And the reason for that logic was we know the time, the statistical average date of death. We know how long we're going to live. And a lot of these pensions that are unsustainable because we're retiring so early relative to date of death. In fact, I spoke to somebody, I won't name who, but somebody very senior in the Chief Actuary's office, because we have a $300 billion, if you believe C.D. Howe, and I do, $300 billion unfunded liability in the federal public pension system. I said, isn't that cause, if we increase the minimum pensionable age from 55 in the public service to 65, would that not wipe out most of that unfunded liability? And he said, yes, but I'll never say that publicly. So part of the solution lies in increasing. You can't draw a pension that's sustainable longer than you paid into it unless you're paying in enormous amounts of money. And so we should be looking at increasing minimum pensionable age across the board, public, private sector, no discrimination, to a minimum of 65. And I realize that won't sit well with a lot of Canadians.
John, go ahead.
Excuse me, I have to go quite short. I have a radio interview at 11:30. I think they're going to ask me how the conference is going, and I'm going to tell them how good I was, so I can't miss that. I think with the pension issue, as with many things, there's a choice between a soft landing and a hard landing, because there is no way that we can pay so many people pensions for so long of $70,000, $80,000, more than the average person was earning at the peak. And so sooner or later, there won't be money in the kitty to pay it. I'm stand corrected by Ian, it's going to be insolvency, not bankruptcy, but it's going to feel fairly similar in many ways. And I think one of the important points here is that it's not fair that some people should be collecting so much money at the expense of people who made less money during their lives. And I think people care a lot about fairness. So I think it's one important way of addressing the issue is to point out that this is not fair. And the other unfair thing, and this too is very important, it is not fair to let people retire at 55 with $70,000 or $80,000, and maybe they married somebody who's also in the public sector, so household income 150, and then 10 years later to tell them, guess what, it's not happening. Because they've built their lives around the assumption that it would happen. So it's not fair to them to have a hard landing either. And I think that's a good way to address it, is to say we need to fix this while we can still fix it without very bad things happening to people that they didn't deserve. Because people in the public sector believed the promise. It was a foolish promise, actuarially and otherwise, but they believed it. And so we don't want to say to them, well, you were a chump, when they're all 70 or 75, and tell them all your plans are being torn up now, and no, there's nothing you can do. So we want to avoid that in the interest of fairness to younger people and in the interest of fairness to older people, in the interest of fairness to everybody. And that, I think, is universally regarded as a good thing.
I just want to make one comment, and then we'll take Wendy and the fellow back there, Paul. Norm's got the mic already. Just give me 1 second, and then we'll go to Norm, and then Wendy. See, that was like John makes a good point, and that was the point of my story about the airplane. With that we can see the smoke coming out of the engine, and the choice we have is, do we want to fly until it's a pile of burning rubble with a whole bunch of absolute unbelievable misery, or do we want to admit there's smoke coming out of the engine and we're going to land it on the highway and figure out what we're going to do about it? And so one of the things that in your handout, one of the things that we started on and then we sort of ran out of energy and money to do, but we had a weekly letter that we were sending out called "Been There, Done That, Shouldn't Have," which John was writing them predominantly, but it's sort of the reasons for stories, because some people, like, they can understand the stories, and we need to start, we need to talk about this. So before the conference is over, over the next 2 days, I'd like you to take a look at the "Been There, Done That, Shouldn't Have," the stories. A couple of other examples we had of the stories. One was about, John's critique of Keynes. So take a look at that, and in our discussion at the end of tomorrow, we'll talk about whether that's something that we should try and, reinvigorate, and all of us make a commitment to forward it on to our email friends and one thing and another. So in fact that we can get these messages out to a wider spectrum of the population. Go ahead, Norm.
Okay, Paul told me I have to be very brief.
Yes, you do.
But I'm going to be. This is in regards to Agenda 2030 and what the total cost would be. And I just want to go back to 1970. Nimbus 4 satellite measured the spectrum of the Earth and determined that CO2 can no longer cause any further warming. So it's physically impossible for CO2 emissions to cause any warming. That's absolute science. Now, moving ahead to 1992, Mulrooney signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as UN Agenda 21. Since then, we've had the Kyoto Protocol, a whole bunch of trips all over the place. We've had our economy, or energy economy, destroyed by
Norm, we know this stuff. Do you have a question?
I'm just leading up to the question. And the question is, if we were able to get ourselves out of this completely, would we be able to save Canada?
Well, who wants to tackle that one? Maybe we should go back to the comment. Okay, John will take it, sure.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of our problems, but it is not our only problem. I mean, I like to remind people of Adam Smith after the Battle of Yorktown, and someone said, "Oh, Britain is ruined," and Adam Smith said, "There's a great deal of ruin in a nation." Canada has enormous problems. It also has enormous resources. But I think that, the stuff that Ian and Bill are talking about, our capacity to deal with anything is undermined drastically if we don't fix that stuff. How could the federal government respond to the problems of the provinces if it didn't have $700 billion in net debt? That's a very different matter, although in the long run you'd have to sort it out. And you can all buy my documentary on the Constitution. It's one of my worst sellers, even by my standards. Because one of the things it proposed is that if provinces are in such trouble that they need help from the federal government, they stop sending members to the House of Commons until they get themselves out of the hole. That would sure get their attention. So there's a lot of things that we need to do, but we don't have just one problem, so there's no silver bullet. That's one of those things. There is no magic answer to our problems. There's a lot of hard work, there's a lot of different problems, but it's got to be in the spirit that we can find solutions that will leave us better off in the future, and we can actually inspire people to work for this better future. Because I'm sure that we can do it. I'm not sure that we're going to, but I'm very sure that we can.
Would either of you guys like to know? I think we all agree on that. I think it was Paul Harvey that said in the free world, he said, the difficult takes a while and the impossible takes a while longer. You know what I mean? And I think that's what we're looking at is something that seems almost impossible, but we have met, like a free society have met these challenges time and time again. It's a matter of having the discussion and having the resolve to do something about it. And the fact that we're all here talking about it is a good sign that we do have the resolve to do something about it. So go ahead, Wendy.
I just have a couple of questions, I think, probably to Lee. Number one, we have to remember that one of Trudeau's first speeches, he said that he hoped to make Canada the first non-nation state of the UN. Now, that is a horrifying thought. The second thing is, how do we turn that around? Because I've fought for 30 years on all sorts of committees to try and turn the key. But I can guarantee you that Rachel Notley's going to come out with $25 a day daycare for everyone in the province. I'm sure that's going to be an election promise. We're talking about pharmacare for all. we're talking about pensions for all, guaranteed income. They don't care until I have yet to meet, I meet people that say, oh gosh, $25 a daycare, it's $1,800 in my pocket. And that's more important to them than the future. My question is, I don't know what the answer is. How do we turn that key and get a thoughtful, I'm going to say terrible words here, how do we get people educated? I'm just about at the end of my rope of how we turn this around, because free stuff wins. And the next government that gets in that tries to take away the lunch bag, they get one term.
Yeah, you're the educator, Ian. You can tell us how we can educate people. Go ahead.
I didn't put this on my slides because I wanted to pump out so much of the empirical stuff, and so I deliberately left it off, and then I ran out of time to talk about, well, are there solutions? You know, fiscal conservatives complain and whine about the debts and the deficits getting bigger and bigger. I actually believe there are solutions, and I'm going to answer your question. And I think generically, the first answer is that, I'll come back to what you said about a non-state thing in a moment. I have a separate response to that. I do believe there's an answer, and I believe that generically, fiscal conservatives have to parry or respond to every demand by a demand that it be targeted. I don't believe that we can say, no, we can't have funded daycare. I just don't. I think the battle's over. That doesn't mean we have to have universal daycare. That doesn't mean we have to have universal pharmacare. It doesn't mean we have to have any universal. I will only make one exception to my rule I'm putting forward, and that's healthcare itself. And that's simply because every public opinion poll I've looked at, that doesn't mean we can't reform healthcare. And I've got some very good ideas about using private clinics within a single-payer model, but healthcare itself is supported. Believe me, I've looked at multiple polls over many, many years. 90 to 95% support the single-payer model. Now, I'm not Don Quixote, and I do not tilt at windmills, meaning I'm not an idealist that believes in, taking on impossible missions. So, what do? We should be demanding every time and flipping those people who demand universal daycare or demand universal pharmacare. We should be countering with, no, we should not be paying it to wealthy, privileged people like professors. We should be paying it to people who need help. And so I think that this is where progressives are very vulnerable on this issue, because really it's very easy to argue against universality if it means paying that social benefit, as they were doing in Quebec with daycare, to lawyers making $250,000 a year. I don't see how anybody on any social justice level can argue you should be giving subsidized daycare to a lawyer or a medical doctor making astronomical salaries that no one else makes, meaning the top 1%. So my answer to you is every social program demand should be countered with, yes, but targeted. Then we can have a debate over what level of support. Should it be the bottom quintile of income, the bottom 20% of Canadians, the bottom 40%, the bottom, and I have no problem having that debate. But we've got to turn it away from universality. The road we're going down right now in pharmacare just scares me. Because we're talking about giving free drugs to the top 40% of earners in this country. We are talking all professors. We're talking public servants. We're talking Superior Court judges. We're talking medical doctors making $500,000. How can any serious human being who has a sense of moral responsibility say we should give free drugs to a doctor making $500,000 a year? And tax lower income Canadians with a higher GST or some other tax, because that $20 billion is going to come from somewhere. So, on daycare, yes, targeted, only for low income people. So that's my generic answer to these issues. I do think that we can, and on the pension side, very quickly, I just want to get this out. I really do believe OAS has to be folded into GIS and made targeted. I should not be getting OAS. In fact, I've rejected it in writing. I'm not very self-interested. I was going to get a clawed back anyways. Okay, but OAS should not be universal. It should be targeted and rolled into GIS and targeted to people below X income. 70, 80, 90, not 40. Remember, just so everybody who knows what we're talking about, the poverty line in Canada per StatsCan is about $22,000 for a single person, male or female, and about $40,000 for a family of 4. So someone at 80 or 90 is way, way, way above the poverty line. So this is another, again, to make things more targeted. So all our social programs, with the exception of healthcare itself, should be transformed or put forward as targeted, not universal social programs.
Did you want to comment on that? Did you want to comment on that migration thing she meant, the post-national state? Do you want to comment?
Oh, yes,
You
yes,
said
I'm
that-
sorry.
You said you did that.
Yes, I'm sorry. I did, and I completely forgot. This is something that worries me too. I'm in Ottawa. I talk to a lot of people in Ottawa. Ottawa has a unique, we're in a bubble. And there is this belief, deep, strong belief in multilateralism and in NGOs. I think I'm very opposed, I'm very critical of NGOs, and I have been very publicly critical of NGOs because they're unaccountable. I think there is a thing called social license. It's called the National General Election every 4 years. They have social license. NGOs do not have social license. They do not grant social license. They don't give social license. Yet, the progressives, and I want to make a distinction here that maybe others don't make, and I think it's an important distinction, and some may accept it, some may not. The former chief of staff to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a brilliant, brilliant man, professor at Harvard for many years, served in Republican and Democratic administrations. His chief of staff wrote a book, a biography on him very recently, and he made a very important distinction between progressives, liberals, and conservatives. And he put forward in this book, it was just published 3 months ago, he put forward the very provocative argument that liberals and conservatives have much more in common with each other because they see politics and people as imperfect. And so politics is about trying to make things a little bit better, whereas progressives have this holier-than-thou view that they are morally superior and that sovereign governments and voters and we are badly flawed. And so they want to turn power over to NGOs and to international organizations. And so I make a distinction all the time now between progressives versus liberals. And you could say it's the old red liberal versus blue liberal distinction, but I do make that. Others may accept that, may not. But I think that's an important distinction. But there is that very bias, and I'm seeing it over and over in documents and speeches coming out of this administration. I mean, I will say bluntly what I've said before. I think this is the most ideological and radical government in my lifetime, liberal or conservative. I mean, past liberal governments have been very centrist. I don't believe this government is.
Did you want to comment on that, Bill, or you're happy? No, we're good. Well, let's take another question. Right back just by the camera there. Yes.
Can I talk a little bit about fairness regarding pensions? When Bill was talking about the average pension, talking about teachers, it struck me that maybe average may not be precisely what we're talking about, because sometimes teachers work for 2 years, 3 years, and they retire. If they're included in your average, it's going to bring down the average a lot. That's not the point. My question is that I had a friend who's a teacher who retired, and he retired at almost $100,000 a year, so 70% of $100,000 a year, his 5 best years was about $70,000. So if he was teaching for 30 years, how much money did he put into his pension plan? Now, he's going to live for at least 30 years. Because I met him at the gym, he's in good shape. I'm sure he's going to live for 30 years. So, you know, if he lives for 30 years and he's going to get, let's just say constant dollars, he's going to get $70,000 a year. That's $2.1 million. How much money did he put in to that $2.1 million? And how much money do I put in, or taxpayers put in, to that $2.1 million? Do you know the answer to that question?
How much money went into a pension? You brought up several issues there. One of them was, we did an analysis for our book and went back and looked at the historical rates of pay for a police officer. And a police officer was, and fire, they're both in the same situation. After 9/11, their pensions were pumped back 5 years to allow them to retire 5 years earlier. And a typical police officer or fireman started at age 18, where they paid them to go into the colleges that were training them. And by the time they retired at age 52, their pension that they were going to receive was going to pay them by age 65 as much as they had earned over the whole of their working career. And they were going to collect it for another 25 years after that. So that gives you some idea. OMER's pension plan, which is the Ontario Municipalities Employee Retirement System, which is the same as that LAP we looked at. They did an analysis they put out in their annual report, and they showed that at the time of the report, the typical employee had put $50,000 into their plan. I think the number they were collecting was $42,000 on pension, and they were going to receive a total estimated lifetime pension of $940,000 on that employee contribution of $50,000. One of the things that concerns me is the size of those overall pensions. You see that $1.2 trillion that pensions have, 1.5 if you include the private sector, and another billion if you include RRSPs. The public sector pensions own huge assets in banks. They own huge assets of, they love infrastructure because it's got such a great rate of return. The largest real estate owners in Canada, once they purchase those assets, all of those assets are now tax-free. So that's $1 trillion of assets that were previously in the private sector that somebody was going to be paying taxes on. So now you've moved it into pensions. There's no taxes payable. Who's going to pick up the shortfall on the taxes that used to be paid in the assets that the public sector pensions now own? I don't know what the solutions are. Around the world, they've looked at various different components to fix pensions. One over in the UK, they put in a pension levy so that anybody over $80,000 a year was going to be paid a pension tax. Other jurisdictions have looked at taxing limiting pensions to a maximum amount. We tried to do that with Canada and the CRA. However, the unions created a special deal on their voodoo accounting with the government that allows them to get what they call a supplementary pension plan, so that's how they can get up into $200,000 and $240,000 a year on a pension. At Ontario Hydro, taxpayer-funded utility, the previous MLA and MPP in Ontario in charge of pensions estimated that there was 14,000 Hydro Ontario employees, 14,000 of them, who are going to make over $100,000 a year, each and every year for the rest of their life. So there's just, it's so far out of whack. I don't know how you fix it, and unfortunately it takes bold, courageous political leadership to do anything about it. But yes, there certainly is a huge issue on unfairness.
Well, not only does it take bold leadership, it takes, we have one behind, we have one behind you, and then we'll get back to you.
I want to clarify the teacher's pension, because it isn't as good as it sounds, okay? I'm not a teacher, I'm not pro-teachers, but I analyze it.
Okay. We'll get back to that. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, so in any event, okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm an American, and I had no idea that the Canadians had these same problems, but we have the exact same issue in the United States. Every one of our states, some worse than others, our city governments, our counties, and of course our federal government. And my question is this just incredible stupidity? Is it a design in the flaw in the system that causes this? Or is there some agenda? What is it that is causing this all across North America, and I guess in Europe as well, and all over the place?
All right.
Well, I want to answer that.
Okay, go ahead, Paul. Since you've got the mic, what can I say?
Well, it's been brought up a few times, all this stuff is being handed out, $25 daycare and everything else. And if I was to go to the front of the room right now and say that I've got some crystal meth, it's free, who wants to come up here and have some? I think in this room I'd be fairly safe that people wouldn't come running up here. But yet if I say that I have $100 and it's free, everybody takes it. And we become addicted to politicians making promises of free money. And until we come to our senses and say, no, I don't want that, and have politicians that will actually talk about this is immoral, it's wrong, what we're doing to the future generation is wrong, it's not sustainable, but this addiction to free money, and again, I'll go back to Ted Morton, who will be presenting, if we had constitutionality that you had to balance the budget so that we go back to 1950 and we had a balanced budget, and we actually had our own pension plans, we wouldn't be in this mess today. But we got to go back. But it's the free money, and we need to realize that this addiction isn't working, and to be big enough to say no to it. Now I'll let the real people answer.
Okay, yeah, no, that's good. We'll get back to you. You want to comment on that? Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to comment on something that was relevant to Alberta, but you're bang on there, Paul. Recently, just clarification on the United States, the pensions in the U.S. are 70% targeted, and that's all covered by the government that sponsors them. In here, they're integrated with about $20,000 of CPP and old age security. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of that question? In Alberta, it's dominated by the influence of unions. Unions are an extremely powerful force that are completely under, people are completely blissfully unaware of just how serious or how influential unions are. The first meeting that Trudeau had was with a group of unions called the Working Canadians. They actually put them up on the back of a boardroom with all the union leaders. Of course, they were all men, and he was standing behind them with a union hard hat on. But look at Notley, without the unions here, and when you bring, it'll be interesting to see if Morton talks about the 3-minute memberships in the party that were as a result of the teachers getting Redford elected. What was the very first thing she did was handed over $800 million to the teachers, and it's all quid pro quo, and that's a large part of what it's all about. And I think Ian had a comment.
Yeah, you did, yes, yeah.
I do want to address that question because I think it's very important. And by the way, I do have enormous respect for Professor Morton and the importance of the Calgary School and Canadian academic ideas. But I do not agree with him that the constitutional balanced budget, not because I'm against it. First off, I think it's a pipe dream. I don't think you'll get agreement politically. Remember, it takes 7 provinces in the federal government and the parliament, both Senate and House. So I don't think it's practical. Secondly, in the countries where it's been done, you get gaming around, you do things off budget to make sure you're balanced and so forth. So to answer your question, why is it happening? If you do look at the big picture across Canada and the States, most of these, let's call them pension abuses or pension problems, serious problems, are overwhelmingly in the public sector. They're not in the private sector because there's a correcting mechanism. If the pension runs out of money like Nortel, well, then guess what? Some people don't get their pension. It's really harsh. It's really, call it pension Darwinism. But that pension Darwinism doesn't exist in the public sector. And that brings us, and I'll stop right here because I don't want to get too academic, but this leads right into James Buchanan, the brilliant American economist, Nobel laureate, and his whole analysis of public choice theory and how do you constrain the public sector in the absence of the checks and balances that exist in the private sector. That is, private firms, private actors can fail and go bankrupt, whereas governments cannot go bankrupt. And I know it may sound like a pedantic distinction, but it isn't. I mean, insolvency only becomes real when the bond markets cut you off. That's the only check and balance on the public sector, and that doesn't exist on the federal level because they have a printing press called the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Canada. It exists at the state of Detroit or at Chicago or at Newfoundland and Labrador when the day comes, as it will one day, when they get cut off by the bond markets, and then it becomes a political problem because they're going to go inevitably to the governor for a bailout or to the national government for a bailout like Puerto Rico just did with the U.S. Congress, and as Newfoundland and Labrador and New Brunswick will do when they come to Canada, to the federal level.
Well, let's hope. Okay, John Carpe, yeah, go ahead.
Could this would be for either
And Dave Reeser, but yeah, go ahead, John.
For Ian or Bill or both. Can you explain in layman's terms to whom this, the $300 billion that Ontario owes, or the $1 trillion or whatever, to whom do we owe this money? Can you explain that in layman's terms and dumb it down for me? Because I've got some vague ideas, but I've never quite grasped this. So thank you.
I am going to sort of simplify it and make some simplifying assumptions, and some economists may find it too generic and not exactly precise, but it is fair what I'm going to say by and large. Subnational governments, and I mean by that state level governments, state of California, state of Illinois, provincial governments, municipal governments borrow in the real bond market. They go to real bond markets and borrow from real companies, including pensions, by the way. A lot of pensions hold provincial government bonds. But they're going to the market. Notice I said market. This is a part of the capital market. And there are investors out there, pension funds and companies with surplus cash, the Googles and the Apples sitting on literally billions of dollars of reserves. And these are the companies buying them. And they work very closely, of course, or rely on the bond rating companies who then rate these entities in terms of their relative riskiness. But to answer your question, I keep emphasizing this, and there's an enormous distinction in all the literature and everything that's taught in economics. Having a printing press makes all the difference. That is a central bank, because central banks can literally create money. And a subnational government that does not have the Federal Reserve at its disposal, or the Bank of Canada, or the Bank of England, or the Bank of Japan, or the European Central Bank, cannot. So there is some discipline on subnational governments, but only at the extreme, when they literally run out and the bond markets cut them off. And it is happening. Detroit was cut off by the bond markets. So was Greece. So that's why they bailed out Greece. So was Puerto Rico. So don't think that it can't happen. But it usually only happens when it's really, really bad, meaning when the entity, the government entity, is in very bad shape, viz. Greece and Puerto Rico and Detroit.
Ian, I just want to ask a little bit further than what John, but do you know what percentage of the Ontario debt would be held by foreigners, or whether it's...
I can get that data, but I don't have it at my fingertips, sorry. Which is an interesting question, because then that brings in currency risk, depending whether it's priced in US dollars or Chinese RMB or Russian rubles or whatever. Because if it's not priced in Canadian dollars, then you got the further risk. If the Canadian dollar goes down, you got to pay back more.
John, I've actually skipped over Dave twice. Then we'll go back to Marilyn. Dave Reeser's had a question, then I'll go back to Marilyn.
Just to go back to something that Ian Lee said, and this is a kind of a comment in the form of a question, and kind of a little bit different, but Ian said that there's a distinction between progressives and liberals and conservatives. For sure there is. But C.S. Lewis said that progress, if you're heading into a swamp, or well into a swamp, progress involves stopping where you are, backing up to where you went wrong, and then moving in another direction. And my point is that progressives, we don't have a progressive government in Ottawa or in Alberta. We have progressivist governments. And the distinction is the same between elites and elitists. And I guess what I'm saying is that we have to stop ceding the language to the left. Everyone wants progress. I want progress. But right now, where we are situated, well into the swamp, progress comes in the form of true conservatism.
That was a pretty interesting question. Now it's Marilyn's turn. We'll let them comment. We'll take Marilyn's question. They can include their answer in there. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Do you know who is holding Alberta's debt?
I don't know.
I'd have to look it up.
No. Drew, do you happen to know?
It's definitely on the market, and we've
Yeah.
seen it being downgraded from AAA to AA, and our interest rates have gone up. And I think what's the amount we owe every year now on interest, Drew?
Sure. Yeah. Drew is the UCP finance critic, so go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, thank you. Annual interest is $2 billion a year now in Alberta. The last information that I saw was for March 31st. The last borrowing the government of Alberta did was at 3.63% a year, which is even higher than you can borrow for your mortgages, of course, on your house right now. That was interesting. That's the other thing that's interesting. The government of Alberta used to have a policy, or still does have a policy rather, that they wanted half of our borrowing long-term and half of our borrowing short-term. For some reason, Treasury Board of Finance has gone to about 80% short-term. Greatly concerned me at a time interest rates were going up. That's maybe changed, but that may reflect a little more difficulty borrowing as well. And in response to Marilyn's question, I don't know the exact answer in the specifics, but we've started to borrow a lot more from Australia and the world than we ever used to. Where it goes from there, I don't know.
I haven't confirmed this, but I heard the other day that someone saw Rachel Notley and Joe Cece going into one of those payday loan places. So, like, who knows? Like, I haven't confirmed that yet. So, Ian wanted to comment on that.
I'm going to jump in there quickly because Paul Martin, actually the one who started it, because his interest rates were going down, 30-year bonds were coming due. He went to 5 year, 3 year, then 1 year because their interest rates lowered. So they love to go to the short term, but when we hit the wall, it's going to allow us to go up really fast. And
it works when the rates are on a down cycle. You're absolutely right. But now we're facing a long-term upward cycle unless there are people that believe it's going to remain at these unprecedented low levels. Thank you very much for those numbers because it reveals there's more risk than just the sheer interest on the debt. There's the interest rate risk in addition to the capital borrowed. And if you're borrowing, and this is where it gets really dangerous, if you're borrowing offshore in foreign currencies, there's the very serious currency risk. In Argentina in the last crisis, I'm talking 10 years ago, that's when the U.S. had to intervene because the peso collapsed by 90%, and they had most of their borrowings were denominated in U.S. dollars, and so their cost of borrowing basically went up 90%, and they were unable to pay, and so they had to do that huge bailout of Argentina. So these are ordinary Canadians don't think about these things, but these are very serious when the debt starts to become bigger and bigger. When it's very small as a percentage of GDP or in absolute terms, it doesn't matter. But when a government is borrowing year after year after year, which you are doing in Alberta and we are doing even more so in Ontario, by the way, we're the master champions, it's getting worse, it's compounding, and then we're running into the Trudeau problem. I'm talking Pierre Trudeau, and that's the magic of compounding. And that's where it took off on us after he'd actually left office. Mulroney was the one who inherited the problem of the magic or misery of compound interest.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to just give you a quote of Winston Churchill's that may answer this lady's question about why people want things for nothing and don't realize where the money's coming from. But I think we all know in this room that there's nothing government can give you that it hasn't already taken from you in the first place.
Yes.
So, the other thing I wanted to ask, Ian, you had a table that showed debt to GDP for all the provinces and the country.
Yes.
And there was one exception, Quebec's went down.
Yes.
Is that a function of the equalization payments we give them, or how does that work? How can they be exempt? How can they be the exemption?
I know this is a very sensitive issue for you, and I understand why, because Quebec gets the lion's share of equalization. All I can say, and I'm not here to defend it, is that that's what we agreed to, we Canadians. The last, I think, somebody can correct me, but I think the last equalization agreement was signed by Prime Minister Harper at the time, and that's what our democratic elected leaders did. But to answer your question, there's been a new quiet revolution in Quebec in the last 5 years under, believe it or not, a Liberal premier, and Quebec has been, my partner used to live in Quebec, and they were notorious for the highest tax rates in Canada and out-of-control spending. She moved to Ontario, and she says, Ontario's become Quebec, and Quebec has become Ontario. It's true. Quebec has been cutting and pruning and fine-tuning, and they've changed the daycare program into a targeted daycare program and reduced the benefits to high-income people. They're going down that road, broadly speaking, that I've been discussing. Much more targeted approach to spending and cutting programs that are no longer working. It's actually the one success story in Canada right now at the provincial budgetary level. I would give the only gold star to the province of Quebec.
Thank you, Ian. The one thing, like everybody always says that equalization is in the Constitution, it is, but the formula is negotiated every 5 years. And to the credit of Paul Himon, who's holding the mic, and I'm surprised you didn't just jump right in and interrupt. No, I know. But in any event, in 2005 and 2010, he was an elected MLA, and he practically begged the PC finances ministers not to re-sign the equalization agreement. And yet they said, oh, well, we have to, whatever, all this BS. But that's what we did. And that's another thing we have to do, is we have to say we're not re-signing this, and then we'll see what happens. But it's a fallacy to say that. I mean, a lot of people just say, oh, it's in the Constitution, there's nothing we can do about it. But it's like everything else in Confederation, it's everything else in your life. You can negotiate it on if you set your mind to it. And so we have a question. Go ahead, young fella. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm not that young.
Well, you're younger than me, I know.
I'm reminded of
several years ago when Eve Adams was still in the good graces of the Conservatives, and she was parliamentary secretary for Veterans Affairs. And I posted on her Facebook page, I suggested that they take the pensions from the politicians and from the military and pool them and divide them. It was promptly removed, and I never heard anything back. But the situation with pensions, my dad has a private sector pension, and it was mismanaged, and the value was cut in half. So the solutions were to either cut the pension benefits in half, or increase contributions by the current employees, or some sort of combination thereof. Well, the younger employees, the current employees, couldn't walk, so that wasn't the solution. So the burden was borne by the pensioners in its entirety. So that's kind of on a micro scale. On a macro scale, that's a situation we're facing, I think, in Canada, where those who can walk will, because I hear, well, if Trudeau gets in again, I'm leaving the country. So we're walking a very fine line, and if we have the political will to do it, why are we not already voting in conservative governments that will bring in these changes? I mean, if we look at the U.S. and this Alexandria, I call her occasionally coherent, and her following, and we can't even get recall in. It's not really a question, but.
I don't want to be super, I don't want to leave you today with the idea that, all it's doom and gloom and there's no change happening, because we all want progress, as the gentleman said. I don't know if anybody remembers, but Jim Flaherty did something profoundly important, but badly flawed, in 2012, and I was in every budget lockup from, I think, 2006 to last year. In the 2012 budget, he announced that henceforth, public servants could not retire until 65. That's fantastic news. I've been advocating that for a long time, notwithstanding that most of my family were members of the federal public service in their career. However, it was badly flawed because he exempted and grandfathered every living, breathing public servant on the payroll of the government of Canada in 2012. So the next government that gets elected, it's not going to be the Trudeau government, I understand that. But if a Conservative government is elected, I hope that you, all of you, start lobbying the government of Canada to move forward. And of course, we're not going to blow them out and say tomorrow morning you're over, but say announce a 10-year transition so that people have time to make changes. Someone who's in the public service who's 45 today saying, hey, I'm out the door at 55, they'll have 10 years, and 10 years I think is fairly reasonable, to serve notice that 10 years from now the plan will be changed so that you may not take your pension before 65, which is the average, pretty close, and Bill will know the number, the average age in the private sector is pretty close to 65, I think. Okay. So remember, the federal government has a huge impact on labor markets across Canada, including provincial and municipal governments. There are 300,000 people in the core public service, and that's what it's called, the core. If you look at the larger public service, which includes military and RCMP, it's over 500,000. And so they set important standards and precedents that other governments and agencies follow. So if they change the Flaherty rule, which was an excellent rule, but the execution was bad by grandfathering everybody literally till they left the public service. So people after that date of that budget have to wait till 65, but there's still 500,000 people in there that are still under the old rules. That can be changed by an amendment, a legislative amendment that will move that back to, say, a 10-year phase-in and not being allowed to retire until 65.
Last question, Josh is.
Yeah, this is for Ian as well. Okay. You mentioned the central banks essentially function as printing presses. Now, based on my rudimentary understanding of international economics, if you use your central bank as a printing press, your monetary supply increases faster than your demand, which leads to interest rates coming down. Debt's cheaper to get on a consumer level. Would that not cause more problems on an economic level down the road, including currency depreciation, and based on, like, we're an export-based economy, like what kind of damage could that cause?
Can you answer that in 1 minute, Ian? That's okay. That's what we have.
I'm going to keep it very high level. No, you're absolutely right. I didn't say, I'm not advocating irresponsible monetary policy, and there are countries. This isn't theory. Look at Zimbabwe. Look at Venezuela. That's exactly what they did. I'm just saying that from the point of view of the capital markets, they treat sovereign debt differently from a risk analysis point of view than subnational debt called Alberta. Alberta's going to pay a higher rate, and Ontario, than the government of Canada because they don't have a printing. I'm being a little colloquial and a little bit flippant when I call it the printing press, and I'm not suggesting the Bank of Canada has been irresponsible or profligate. I'm just simply saying you have that ability, especially in times of crisis, the fiscal crisis of 2008, when the Federal Reserve just pumped it out, and so did the Bank of Canada, so did the Bank of England. So I'm just making that distinction between the two levels of government. And that was under.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, we're right on schedule. Sir, did you want to I didn't mean to cut you off on the pension thing. Do you want to say something really quick on it? You've got about 30 seconds. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I did an analysis of the CBE, Calgary Board of Education pension, for another reason, but they have a number 85, which is your sum of your service and your age, and when you get to that 85 number, you qualify for the full pension, more along the lines that you were talking about. But you can qualify early at a penalty. And if you're 10 years early, you get nothing. Other than you get your contributions, which are 10.27% a year, and you get a rate of return on that of about 1%. So, and then the other thing is, a lot of teachers have spouses, and when they elect for the survivor benefit, that changes the pension down dramatically. And when a teacher passes away, there's no longer a pension has to be paid. So there's all kinds of...
There's a 10 million details. I appreciate that, so that's good. Okay.
They don't all get 70.
No, I know, but the ballpark numbers, fair enough. Thank you very much. We've had a really...
I want to add one other
Yeah,
thing.
okay.
In 2006, when we started having surplus funds and creating that 17 billion pension fund, there was an MLA that begged the government to pay the teachers unfunded liability of $2 billion, and they refused to do it, saying, oh, that's in the future. But we could have been off the teachers' pension fund for $2 billion back in like 2007 and had it fully funded, which is pretty sad that we're now at 17 billion, and the actuaries figured that it'll be 50 billion by 20, I can't remember, 35 or something.
Yes, exactly.
So
that's
anyway.
the solution. Yeah.